Tin Audio is one of those slightly obscure chi-fi manufacturers who have received a decent amount of hype, starting a bit more than a year ago and then again more recently with their P1 model. They primarily produce some really affordable products, and their T2 model in particular has received perhaps the most hype. But how good can a $50 set of IEMs really be? Perhaps the most surprising thing about the T2 when first taking them out of the box is just how well designed and robust the housing is. Each shell seems to have been constructed and machined out of a single piece of metal, and there is a nice mix of both brushed and either sand or bead blasted finishes. It just looks considerably more premium than what the $50 price tag would suggest. If you want a bit more details on the build and a closer look at the cable, check out the link in the description, which will take you to the full written review. I think from a comfort perspective, Tin Audio did a relatively good job in the design of these, as I can't say that they created any discomfort for me whilst wearing them. But having said that, they have a pretty shallow fit, and so they don't feel very secure, even when wearing them with the cable going up and over the ear. As for the driver setup used here, we have something quite unusual. That's not to say that it's weird, just a little unusual, and that's because these IEMs feature dual dynamic drivers in each earpiece. Usually, dual driver IEMs will feature either two balanced armature drivers or a hybrid setup in which there's one dynamic in addition to one balanced armature, but very rarely do we see the implementation of two dynamic drivers. So how do these sound? Well, for $50 they're actually pretty decent. The bass level is on the lighter side, and so it does come across as rolled off, and there isn't a great deal of sub-bass extension either. The signature overall I think is intended to be more neutral, but it definitely leans to a brighter than neutral flavor. As such, the upper mids and treble are more prominent than the mids and the bass, which tends to give it a perhaps more airy and seemingly detail-orientated presentation. I specifically say seemingly detail-orientated because this doesn't really feel like what I would describe to be a natural-sounding set of IEMs. As far as I'm concerned, what sounds natural should also technically be the most detailed it can ever sound. For example, if you record the sound of a violin or perhaps a piano or whatever instrument, and then you play that recording back through a particular driver, whether that be a speaker, IEM or a headphone, if that reproduction of sound doesn't sound exactly the same way as what the instrument sounded naturally, then what you are hearing is by definition distortion, not detail. This is why it's a bit of a pet peeve for myself when I read or hear people talking about headphones or IEMs somehow being extremely detailed or revealing. I mean, sure, it depends largely on the context, but those words tend to be used as nothing more than euphemisms for when a driver has an elevated response in the upper mids and or treble region. Don't get me wrong though, this is not to say that you should not or whatever, you could not enjoy a bit more presence in those regions, but I do feel that it's important to understand that such a response is not synonymous with what a detailed response really should be. That's what studio monitors and so-called reference headphones are supposed to be for. So in the case of these, the T2, that elevated treble does get a little bit hot for my liking, but it's also not so bad as to come across as a completely bright sounding pair. I think it kind of hits that middle ground between neutral and the more treble forward signatures that we've heard from so many other chi-fi IEMs. This is also very dependent on the type of ear tips you use, as I feel that to really get the best out of the T2, they must be used with these foam tips. These tips really do help to noticeably reel in the treble whilst elevating the bass and mids just a tiny bit, a combination of which brings it closer to a more neutral signature, and it avoids any major sharp treble peaks. Soundstage is also better than expected, and it feels quite open, which is possibly due to that shallow insertion depth and slightly more airy signature. It does get a bit narrower when using the foam tips, but I'd happily sacrifice that in favor of a smoother treble response. If you are looking for isolation, however, then these just aren't going to cut it for you, especially if using the silicone tips. At a price of $50, there are two competing products which I can think the T2 should be compared to, and that would be the RE400 from HiFiMan, as well as the M6 Pro 2nd Gen from Me Audio. I have to admit that it's been a while since I've listened to either of those, and a side-by-side comparison to the RE400 in particular really surprised me. The HiFiMan is well known to have quite a neutral tuning overall, but I honestly didn't think that I would prefer the T2. Before I began, I thought that the T2 would sound less smooth and just an overall slightly different flavor of neutral. But what I found instead was that the T2, despite having a slightly more sparkly treble response, actually sounded considerably smoother and more refined than what the RE400 did. Sure, I could definitely hear the increase in the bass response from the RE400, but the signature overall just felt harsher. Swapping over to the M6 Pro surprised me yet again. It has way more bass presence than either the T2 or the RE400, but it seemed like a fair amount more bass than what I remembered it to have from a couple of months ago. Switching between the T2 and the M6 Pro revealed that I again felt the T2 has the more refined sound character, as the M6, at least in direct comparison, sounded noticeably darker, narrower, and boomy. I think most people might still prefer the M6 for its bass response and the more subdued treble, but when we are talking about sonic accuracy, especially when listening to instrumental music, then the M6 just has way too much bass and not enough presence in the mids and the treble. So for $50, is the T2 worth the asking price? Well, yeah, I reckon so. The truth is, the sub $100 market, and especially around the $50 price point, is becoming more competitive by the day. So who knows how long it might be until we can get an objectively better product for maybe $20 or $30, if indeed that's not already the case. But for now, and with reference at least to the M6 Pro and the RE400, I think the T2 holds a decent amount of value, especially given the build quality and its sound signature as a whole. Well, that's it for this quick review on the T2. I'm curious, if you've got the T2 or you've at least heard it, leave a comment down below and tell me what you think of it. Do you think it's worth the $50 price point, and do you agree with my assessment on the signature? That's all from me for now, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.